This really happened to me, though. Sometimes it still feels like I'm living inside a movie. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the recessed lights. The morning my own family voted me out, my son, at the head smirking as he slid the papers across to me. The dynasty I had built brick by brick from the mud and grit of the American Midwest was stripped away with one motion of his pen. It wasn't a hostile takeover from a rival corporation. It was a coup from within my own bloodline. The air in the room, usually thick with the scent of ambition and expensive coffee, now smelled of something acrid and final. Betrayal had a face, and it carried my last name. It was the face of my son Alan, a face I had once held in my hands, marveling at the miracle of him. Now that face was a mask of cold triumph. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I was born in 1949 in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist and a homemaker. Back then, the air smelled like iron oil and possibility. It was the smell of post-war America, a country flexing its industrial muscle, and I breathed it in like oxygen. My father, a man of few words and calloused hands, worked long nights at the Delco plant. His hands always blackened with grease that no amount of soap could ever fully scrub away. He was a creature of routine and quiet dignity. He'd come home just before dawn, his footsteps on the porch boards, a familiar rhythm of my childhood, and he'd leave a smear of oil on the doorknob, like a signature. My mother Eleanor was the architect of our small world. She stretched every dollar until it screamed, turning my father's modest paycheck into a warm home full bellies and clothes that were patched with near-invisible stitches. She taught me that resourcefulness was a form of power. I grew up with one belief tattooed into my soul. If I wanted more, I had to build it myself. There were no trust funds waiting, no family connections to pave the way. My inheritance was my father's work ethic and my mother's refusal to surrender to circumstance. I watched my father leave for the plant day after day, year after year, his body slowly stooping under the weight of his labor, and I swore to myself that my hands would build something that couldn't be worn down by a factory clock. I wanted to build an edifice, a legacy. In my 20s, I took that lesson and carried it to Cleveland, then later to Chicago, working a string of odd jobs that taught me more about people and commerce than any business school could. I was a dock worker on the Cuyahoga River, a bartender in a smoky jazz club on Rush Street, a door-to-door salesman hawking encyclopedias to families who could barely afford dinner. Each job was a lesson in hustle, in reading a room, in knowing when to push and when to walk away. I saved every penny living in cramped apartments where the sound of the L train rattling past was my nightly lullaby. The dream of my own company was a fire in my gut, keeping me warm through the brutal Chicago winters. It began with a small logistics company, just 3 battered trucks, and a rented garage off Canal Street. The year was 1976. I was 27, still green, but I had a hunger that didn't quit. I named it Wallace Freight. The first truck, a beat-up. International Harvester. I named Eleanor, after my mother. I painted the name on the driver's side door myself. I was the founder, the CEO, the lead driver, the mechanic, and the janitor. I drove through the night, fueled by black coffee and the sheer terror of failure, learning the highways of America, like the lines on my own hand. By the time I was 40, we had contracts with Kroger, then Ford, and suddenly people who once dismissed me were calling me Mr. Wallace. We weren't just Wallace Freight anymore. We were Wallace Freight Logistics, a name that spoke of scale and sophistication. We had a fleet of over 100 gleaming trucks, our logo a stylized W, that looked like a highway stretching to the horizon, a common sight from the plains of Nebraska to the ports of New Jersey. I remembered the first time I saw one of our trucks on a highway. I wasn't driving on. I pulled over to the shoulder and just watched it go, a lump forming in my throat. It was real. I had built it. And yet success has a way of planting snakes right under your feet. It blinds you with its glare, makes you forget that the ground beneath you can give way at any moment. The Dynasty grew by the early 2000s. Wallace Freight Logistics had offices in 6 states, over 1,200 employees, and revenues so high. Even the IRS sent me Christmas cards. We were a pillar of the industry, a testament to what a boy from Dayton with nothing but grit could achieve. I thought my proudest moment was bringing my son Alan into the fold. He'd just graduated from Wharton with honors, sharp as a tack, and brimming with confidence. He had my wife's sharp jaw, her clear, intelligent eyes. He looked like the future. My future. He was the reason I'd built it, all the one who would carry the Wallace name into the next century. But little did I know Alan wasn't interested in carrying my legacy forward. He wanted to take it from me. He saw the company not as a family heirloom to be polished and preserved, but as a rusty old engine to be stripped for parts and sold to the highest bidder. It started small, the way betrayals often do. A dismissive comment in a board meeting about my old-school methods, a preference for consultants with flashy presentations over the counsel of men who had been with me for 30 years. I'd overhear his whispered calls late at night from his office in our Chicago HQ, his voice low and urgent, full of jargon I didn't recognize and names I didn't trust. He hired consultants without telling me, restructured divisions while I was away meeting with clients in Seattle, and convinced the board that my methods were outdated, that I was a relic from an analog age in a digital world. We need to be agile. Dad, he'd say, his tone, a careful blend of respect and condescension. We can't be sentimental. I ignored the whispers. I dismissed the unease coiling in my gut. A father's love blinds the eyes. You see the child you raised, the boy you taught to ride a bike, not the man who is sharpening a knife behind his back. My wife Sarah would have seen it. She'd been gone 10 years, taken by an unforgiving cancer, but her intuition had always been my compass. Be careful of ambition that has no heart. James, she used to tell me, looking pointedly at Alan after he'd made some particularly ruthless comment. I missed her wisdom, now more than ever. But one cold January morning the blindness was shattered. I was looking for a misplaced contract in Alan's office. He had taken over the main executive suite, relegating me to a smaller founder's office. Down the hall, and I discovered a draft proposal in his desk drawer. It wasn't hidden. Well, his arrogance had made him careless. It was a full plan, meticulously detailed in PowerPoint slides and financial projections, to oust me as CEO. They called it Operation Phoenix, as if I were the old world that had to burn, so he, magnificent and new, could rise from my ashes. The clinical cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just a business plan. It was a character assassination, filled with phrases like cognitive decline, resistance to innovation, and graceful transition into retirement. The humiliation hit hardest when my grandson Michael, barely 18, and a freshman at Northwestern, repeated words I never thought I'd hear from my own blood. We were at a Sunday dinner, and he said, with all the unthinking certainty of youth, "Grandpa, maybe it's time you step aside. Dad says the company needs younger vision to compete globally." He was just parroting his father, a puppet, mouthing the words of the master, but the strings were attached directly to my heart. I wanted to rage, to scream, to flip the dining table and tell them all what a viper they were nurturing. But rage is wasted breath when the knives are already out. It only makes you look weak, unhinged. That was the moment I realized. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted my name back, my true legacy, I'd need to plot my revenge as carefully as I once plotted every single freight route across America's highways. And believe me, I did, because the Wallace name wasn't going to end in betrayal. It was going to end in fire. The room seemed smaller that day, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. My son leaned back in his leather chair, my chair in my office, confident, smug, certain he'd won. The board members, men and women who once toasted me at Christmas parties and asked my advice on their children's college applications, avoided my eyes. They stared at the polished surface of the table, at their manicured fingernails, anywhere but at the old man. They were sacrificing. My signature was supposed to seal the deal, to transition me gracefully into retirement, a generous severance package, a title of chairman emeritus, a golden cage for a lion they were declawing. But instead of signing, I folded the papers once, twice, slid them back across the table and said quietly, my voice resonating in the sudden silence, you've just declared war on the wrong man. And war, as Alan would soon learn, is something I'd been preparing for my whole life. War doesn't always begin with guns or fists. Sometimes it begins with silence, with patience, with the discipline to play dumb while your enemy digs his own grave. That night after the board meeting, I went home to the house I'd lived in for over 30 years, in Kenilworth, the one Alan had begged me to sell, for a sleeker penthouse in downtown Chicago. It's a mausoleum, Dad, he'd said, but it was my home. My wife's favorite photos still lined the mantel, her smile frozen in time since her passing. The scent of her, a faint trace of lavender, still seemed to linger in the curtains. She would have known exactly what to do with Alan. She always saw through people quicker than I did. She saw the hollowness in Alan long before I was willing to admit it existed. I poured myself a glass of Glenfiddich, a 25-year-old single malt, and sat in the leather chair by the fire, letting the rage simmer into clarity. The initial shock, the hot, blinding anger, was cooling into something harder, colder. It was forging itself into a weapon. They thought they had won. My own flesh and blood had cornered me, believing I was a tired old bear, ready for hibernation. But if there's one thing life had taught me, it's that cornered animals fight the hardest, and I wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The first step was information. Always information. In logistics, you win by knowing the routes, the weather, the weak points in your competitor's supply chain. In war, you win by knowing your enemy. I began with small things, calling up old friends in the company, men who owed me favors, secretaries who remembered whose Christmas bonuses I had personally saved during the recession of '91. I started with Frank, my first ever hire, now the head of the dispatchers union. We met at a Greasy Spoon diner in Cicero, the kind of place Alan wouldn't be caught dead in overburnt coffee. Frank told me how morale had plummeted. Alan was all about algorithms and automation, treating drivers who'd been with me for decades like obsolete parts. Whispers came back to me like little birds. Alan was making moves, not just to replace me, but to erase me. He was leaking stories to the press, planting items with friendly journalists about my declining health, painting me as a doddering old man, unfit to lead a modern corporation. It was a classic, brutal strategy. Discredit the king to legitimize the usurper. What Alan didn't realize was that I'd kept meticulous records for decades. Files, receipts, contracts, every handshake deal that built the company. I was from a generation that didn't trust the cloud. I trusted steel and paper, I kept them in a fireproof cabinet in my study, and when I opened it that night, the sight nearly brought me to tears. Binders filled with faded ink ledgers with my own handwriting. My entire life documented in paper and ink was now my arsenal. But revenge isn't just about what you have. It's about what you can uncover. I needed someone who could operate in the shadows. Alan now occupied. I hired a private investigator, a wiry Vietnam vet named Donnie, who'd once worked security for our freight yards in Detroit. ID fired him once for drinking on the job, then hired him back a week later after he showed up sober and asked for a second chance. He'd been loyal ever since. Donnie had the kind of face that blended in anywhere, but his eyes, pale and sharp, saw everything. We met in a dimly lit bar near Midway. I slid an envelope thick with cash across the table. "I need you to watch my son," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Donnie didn't flinch. He just nodded, pocketed the envelope, and said, "Who do you want him to be?" "Mr. Wallace, I want you to find out who he already is," I replied. Within 2 weeks, he came back with photographs Alan in New York, meeting with Marcus Thorne, the CEO of our fiercest competitor, Trident Logistics. They were shaking hands over cocktails at the Plaza Hotel. Thorne was a shark who had tried to drive me into bankruptcy in the 90s with a vicious price war. I had nearly lost everything, keeping him at bay, working 100 hours weeks, sleeping in my office. And now Alan, my son, was bringing him in through the front door. The pictures were grainy, but the betrayal was crystal clear. I remember staring at those photos, my heart pounding in my chest with a slow, heavy rhythm, like a funeral drum. It wasn't business anymore. This was a desecration. My son, my heir, the boy I raised, colluding with the very rivals who'd tried to crush us. I had nearly gone bankrupt, keeping them at bay, and now Alan was bringing them back in through the front door. This wasn't a plan for the future. It was a fire sale. The betrayal was complete. But proof of betrayal is not the same as victory. If I struck too soon, I'd look like a bitter old man, clinging to power, lashing out with fabricated evidence. I needed Alan to believe I was beaten, to lower his guard, to let his arrogance blind him completely. And so I played the part. I stopped coming into the office every day. I issued a public statement through my lawyer, wishing my son the best, and announcing my retirement to spend more time with my family and my hobbies. I let the press run their stories about my retirement, even gave a few polite scripted interviews saying how proud I was of Alan and his bold new vision. Behind the mask of resignation, I watched, I listened, I waited. I attended a charity luncheon and saw Alan across the room. He gave me a magnanimous nod, the kind a victor gives to the vanquished. I smiled back, a quiet, empty smile, while inside I was mapping his destruction. Alan moved fast, too fast. His hubris was his weakness. He replaced loyal managers, men who had started with me in the garage, with his own people, slick MBA types, inexpensive suits, men more loyal to money than to honor. He shifted contracts, restructured debt, and cut corners on maintenance and safety protocols to boost quarterly profits. On the surface, it looked brilliant. The company's stock rose. The business magazines called him a visionary successor. But Donnie and I dug deeper, and what we found made my blood run cold. Donnie's investigation, now funded with a blank check from me, went beyond surveillance. He found a disgruntled accountant. Alan had fired a woman with a conscience and a grudge. She started feeding us documents in secret. It turned out the deal with Trident wasn't a merger. It was a planned sell-off of our most profitable routes in exchange for a massive personal kickback for Alan. He was siphoning funds into shell companies registered in Panama. He was hiding money offshore, setting up a golden parachute for himself, in case things went south. Worse, he was leveraging our company's assets, the trucks, the warehouses, the very land I had bought, against risky real estate deals in Miami. Deals tied to people whose names had been whispered in federal indictments. My son wasn't just betraying me. He was gambling the entire dynasty, everything I had built from nothing, on greed and arrogance. He was going to gut the company, sell the pieces and walk away a billionaire, leaving the 1,200 employees who depended on Wallace Logistics for their livelihoods with nothing. That was when I knew this wasn't about saving my pride anymore. This was about saving my name, my employees, and the company that bore the Wallace legacy. It was about every driver who spent weeks away from his family, every mechanic working through a cold night, every dispatcher juggling 100 calls. Alan was spitting on all of them, and I would burn Alan's empire to the ground before I let him destroy mine. The turning point came at a gala in downtown Chicago, hosted at the Palmer House, Hilton. It was a black-tie event for Midwest business leaders, the kind of room where fortunes were made with handshakes and reputations destroyed with whispers. Alan stood at the podium basking in the spotlight, introducing himself as the new era of Wallace Freight Logistics. He was charming, eloquent, and utterly fraudulent. I stood at the back, hidden in the crowd, a ghost at his feast. I watched as he shook hands, laughed too loudly, promised partnerships he couldn't possibly deliver. He didn't see me slip into the side room, where his laptop sat open on a table. Donnie had tipped me off. The password was my birthday, 08141949. My birthday. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it nearly made me laugh. It was as if he was mocking me, using the day of my birth as the key to my destruction. My hands were shaking, but my mind was cold and clear. Within minutes, I had copied his entire hard drive onto a flash drive. Offshore accounts, falsified invoices, the unredacted Trident deal emails, detailing the kickback scheme. It was all there, a digital spider's web of greed, but still patience. Vengeance, like a good scotch, needs to be aged. Evidence only matters when revealed at the right moment. I needed Alan's downfall to be public, undeniable, catastrophic. I couldn't just leak it to a reporter. That would be a scandal. But he might survive it, spin it. I needed to execute him in the court of his own peers. So I waited. And in waiting, I became something new, not just a father betrayed, but a man sharpening his vengeance into a blade so fine it could sever a soul. Alan believed he had stripped me of my power. But what he didn't realize was, this power is not in titles or board votes. Power is knowing where the skeletons are buried and who's willing to dig them up. The question was no longer if I would bring him down. It was how spectacularly I would do it. And that answer would come sooner than Alan ever imagined. Because within 3 months, I would stand in the very boardroom where he humiliated me. And this time, the papers on the table would not be for my resignation. They would be for his ruin. Spring in Chicago has a way of hiding daggers in the sunshine. The city feels alive again after the brutal winter, but beneath the bright skies and the budding trees along Michigan Avenue, shadows linger. That's how I felt, walking through the streets that April, smiling to neighbors, shaking hands with old friends at church, playing the part of the contented retiree, while inside I was a storm, sharpening itself for the strike. Alan didn't know it, but every step he took forward was a step deeper into the quicksand. I was patiently mixing. He was building his image as a modern CEO, appearing on CNBC, giving speeches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, even getting a fawning profile in the Wall Street Journal. They painted him as the heir, who courageously saved a legacy company from his outdated sentimental father. I clipped those articles, saved the broadcasts, and filed them away in a binder labeled Hubris, because when the fall came, I wanted proof of how high he thought he was flying. Meanwhile, Donnie and I kept digging. The flash drive had given us a roadmap, but we needed the bodies to go with the bones. Donnie went to Miami, posing as an investor, and confirmed the shady real estate deals. He got pictures of Alan meeting with a known money launderer. It wasn't just corporate malfeasance anymore. This was bordering on organized crime. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation in Delaware named Phoenix Enterprises, falsified tax write-offs for properties that didn't exist. But it wasn't enough to expose him privately. I wanted the board, the investors, and the entire country to see him for what he was, a thief wearing my name. The trick, though, was timing. You can't kill a king in secret and expect the kingdom to follow you. You have to drag him into the public square and let everyone watch the beheading. That opportunity came with the annual shareholders meeting, scheduled for June at our Chicago headquarters. It was Alan's masterpiece, his grand unveiling. He planned to announce his 5-year growth plan, a flashy presentation designed to woo investors with promises of expansion into international markets, an expansion funded by money he was actively stealing. He had invited analysts, reporters from every major financial publication, even a few city government officials. The stage was set for his coronation, and I was going to turn it into his execution. But before revenge, there's always a final test of patience. I had to endure family dinners, where Alan grinned at me across the table sipping his expensive wine as though nothing was amiss. He'd talk about synergy and disruption, and I'd nod along my heart, a cold stone in my chest. My grandson Michael, home from college for the summer, repeated his father's words like scripture. The future is digital, Grandpa. It's about data, not diesel. Dad says your way of doing business is ancient history. It stung more than I cared to admit. To see my own grandson look at me with such dismissive pity was a unique kind of pain. But sting can be a gift. It sharpens resolve. I swallowed the humiliation, nodded, and let them think I was fading into irrelevance, a ghost at their table. Behind the scenes, I assembled my arsenal. I brought in a forensic accountant. Donnie knew a meticulous woman named Claire, who had once worked for the IRS. She could smell fraud in a single misplaced decimal. She spent weeks in a rented anonymous office suite combing through the data from the flash drive, cross-referencing it with the documents the disgruntled accountant had provided, tracing every wire transfer, every shady invoice. When she finally dropped a thick 3-ring binder on my desk, her words chilled me. Mr. Wallace, if this goes public, it's not just a scandal. It's criminal. We're talking federal prison time. That was when I contacted the SEC. Quietly, carefully, through a lawyer, acting as an intermediary for an anonymous tip, I handed over copies of the most damning evidence, knowing they'd take their time. That government wheels grind slow. But I didn't need them to move fast. I just needed them watching. When Alan put on his show, I laid the breadcrumbs, confident they would follow the trail right to the boardroom door on the day of the meeting. And in parallel, I began reaching out to allies. I thought I'd lost old board members. Alan had forced out retired executives, even union leaders from our freight yards like frank men and women who remembered the long nights, the strikes. He'd personally negotiated the bonuses he'd fought tooth and nail to protect. Many had felt pushed aside when Alan took power, replaced by his slick consultants and Ivy League cronies. We met secretly in old diners and quiet hotel bars. When I laid out the evidence, when I showed them what Alan was really doing to the company we had all built together, They didn't just listen. They clenched their fists. The whispers began to circulate. Not enough to alert Alan. His arrogance made him deaf to them anyway. But just enough that by the time the meeting arrived, the air in that boardroom would be thick with suspicion, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The night before the shareholder meeting, I barely slept. I sat in my study, the binder of evidence open on the desk, the photographs of Alan shaking hands with Marcus Thorne laid out like a tarot reading of doom. My late wife Sarah's picture sat on the desk beside me, her eyes calm, her smile unwavering. I whispered to her, though I wasn't sure if I believed in such things anymore. Tomorrow, Sarah. Tomorrow I bring him down. Tomorrow I take back what's ours. The morning came heavy with storm clouds, the kind that darken the city like an omen. Reporters gathered in the lobby of our headquarters, a building my ambition had raised into the sky. Cameras flashed as Alan strode through the revolving doors in his tailored navy suit, looking every inch the conquering king. And for a moment, watching from the mezzanine where I stood unnoticed, I almost pitied him. Almost. He was a fool playing king, unaware. The headsman was already in the room. The boardroom was packed. Investors lined the gleaming mahogany table. Analysts and press filled the back rows, and cameras rolled from discreet corners. Alan stood at the podium, a picture of modern corporate leadership clicking through slides filled with buzzwords: disruption, globalization, innovation, applause, followed each grand promise. Though I noticed more than one shareholder exchange wary glances. The seeds of doubt had been planted. I waited until the halfway mark of his presentation, when Alan began describing his international expansion plan, the crown jewel of his strategy, funded by the very shell companies we had uncovered. That was my moment. I rose from my seat at the back and walked slowly, deliberately down the central aisle to the front. Conversations hushed, heads turned, cameras swiveled. A ripple of confusion and shock spread through the room. Alan froze mid-sentence, the confident smile faltering on his lips, his jaw tightening as I reached the podium and stood beside him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the podium microphone. "But before you promise these fine people the moon, perhaps you should explain where their money has really been going." Gasps rippled through the room. Alan's face, drained of color, then flushed a furious red. "This is nonsense," he barked, trying to regain control. "My father is confused. He's not well." I cut him off, my voice like ice confused. "Let me unconfuse you." I set the thick binder on the podium with a heavy thud that echoed in the silent room. I opened it and held up a Pajay bank statement from a Cayman Islands account. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Shell Corporations in Delaware. False tax write-offs. Millions of dollars siphoned from this company, not for growth, but for your personal empire. I turned a page, and here's the agreement with Trident Logistics. The one where you sell off our most profitable routes for a $30 million personal kickback. Then I looked him straight in the eye. You used my birthday as your password to orchestrate all of this. That's not vision, son. That's arrogance. The room erupted. Shareholders shouted questions. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Cameras zoomed in on Alan's sweating brow. Board members who had backed him leaned forward, whispering urgently, their faces masks of panic. Alan tried to regain control, slamming his hand on the podium and yelling about lies and senility, but the damage was done. The king was naked, and the crowd was laughing. And then, as if on cue, the boardroom doors opened. 2 men and a woman in dark conservative suits entered the room, federal agents from the SEC. They walked straight to the podium, flashed their badges, and one of them said in a calm, firm voice, "Alan Wallace, we need you to step aside for questioning." The sight was biblical. My son, once so untouchable in his Wharton arrogance, was reduced to a stammering, sweating wreck under the cold, impassive gaze of the law. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. In that moment, he finally understood. This wasn't a random audit. This was me. I didn't smile. Not yet. Revenge tastes best when savored slowly. But as they led him out of the room past the flashing cameras and the stunned faces of the world he had tried to conquer, I locked eyes with the board and said quietly, "You thought I was finished. But I built this company with my own 2 hands, and I won't let my name be destroyed by greed." The room fell silent. The war wasn't over, but the battle had just turned. The chaos after Alan's public unmasking was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my 50 years of business. The shareholders' meeting dissolved into a pandemonium of frantic phone calls and hushed, panicked conferences. Lawyers poured into side rooms and reporters smelling the biggest corporate scandal of the decade camped outside the Wallace Freight Logistics building like vultures circling a fresh kill. My name was suddenly on every tongue again, not as a relic of the past, but as the man who had pulled the trigger on a dynasty-shaking scandal. The old lion had roared, and the jungle was in an uproar. But revenge doesn't end with the first blow. That's just the opening salvo. It needs follow, through a relentless tightening of the noose, until the villain can no longer breathe. Alan's ruin had to be absolute, not just for my satisfaction, but for the survival of the company itself. Alan's high-priced lawyers tried to spin it immediately. They released statements claiming the SEC's inquiry was routine, a misunderstanding, and that the documents I presented were fabricated by a bitter retiree struggling with his diminished role. But the problem with lies is that once doubt is planted, truth grows like a weed, fast and uncontrollable. Every financial journalist in Chicago was hungry for blood. They started digging calling sources, corroborating the details from my binder, which had been leaked to a select few. Within 48 hours, the headlines blared across the Chicago Tribune and Crane's Business Wallace. Dynasty in turmoil founder accuses son of massive fraud. SEC investigates Wallace Logistics. CEO after dramatic showdown. I watched the evening news alone in my study, a glass of scotch in hand, my late wife's picture beside me on the desk. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of grim peace. Alan's smug, confident grin was gone, replaced by grainy footage of him ducking cameras, his face pale and drawn as he scurried out of a federal courthouse. Still, this wasn't just about public humiliation. Alan had woven his corruption deep into the company's operational and financial bones. His risky leveraging and fraudulent contracts had put us on the brink. If I didn't act fast, his recklessness could drag the whole empire into bankruptcy, taking the livelihoods of 1,200 families with it. That was when the board called me. The same men and women who had so eagerly shown me the door now summoned me back, their voices laced with a fear that was almost satisfying to hear. They wanted me back, not permanently, not as CEO. Their pride wouldn't allow for such a complete reversal, but as an interim advisor to help them navigate the storm. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months earlier, they'd voted me out as obsolete. Now, with the ship sinking, they begged the old captain to come back and steady the wheel. I agreed, but only on my terms. I met them in the same boardroom, now feeling less like a tomb and more like my territory. Once more, I don't want the title. I told them, my voice measured and cold, I don't need it. But he'll tell you this, if you want this company to survive, Alan can never step foot in this building again. Not as CEO, not as a board member, not even as a consultant. His shares will be placed in a blind trust, controlled by the company. His name is poison. Now, you will cut him out completely, or you can watch the whole thing burn to the ground. Your choice." They hesitated, but the fear of ruin is stronger than loyalty to a failed leader. Within a week, a press release announced Alan's formal permanent removal and my appointment as a special advisor to the board. The Dynasty carried our name, but only mine remained attached to it in any meaningful way. Alan didn't take it quietly. He called me one night using his one phone call after being formally charged and released on bail. His voice was a raw mix of rage and desperation. "You think you've won. You think this is over. I'll bury you, old man. I'll leak every piece of dirt, every corner this company ever cut. I'll drag this company down with me if I have to." I let the silence stretch before I answered my own voice, devoid of emotion. "You already tried, Alan. But here's the difference between you and me. I built it to last through storms. You built it to steal in the sunshine." He cursed me a string of venomous, pathetic words and shouted until the line went dead. I sat there in the dark, the phone heavy in my hand, a familiar hollowness spreading in my chest. This wasn't just business. This was my son, my blood threatening to destroy everything I loved out of pure spite. Revenge is satisfying, yes, but it leaves scars. It carves out a piece of your own soul. The SEC investigation stretched for months. It was a grueling process of depositions and audits. Donnie and Claire worked alongside the feds, becoming their most valuable assets. They provided documents traced, wire transfers, through a dizzying network of offshore banks, and testified in closed rooms. Every new discovery was another nail in Alan's coffin-bribed port. Inspectors falsified shipping manifests to hide the movement of untaxed goods, even whispers of money laundering through those Miami real estate deals. The press devoured every leak. My once proud son became a public villain, a caricature of corporate greed. Talk shows mocked him, calling him the Prince of Fraud. Investors who had once toasted him at galas now joined a class action lawsuit against him. His so-called friends vanished. Even his own wife, a woman who had enjoyed the fruits of his ambition, filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable greed in the court documents. I should have felt triumphant I had won. But watching him collapse, watching his life get dismantled piece by piece, I felt something else, too, something sharp and bitter, lodged deep in my chest. Pity. Not enough to forgive. Never that his betrayal was too absolute. But pity for the boy I once bounced on my shoulders, the boy I thought would carry my name with pride and honor. Where had I gone wrong? Had my own ambition created his? Was his greed a twisted reflection of my own drive? The questions haunted my quiet nights. Revenge had destroyed him, but it hadn't brought back what I truly lost: my family. The final blow came nearly a year later, in a federal courtroom on Dearborn Street. The trial was a spectacle. I sat in the back of the gallery, a silent observer as the prosecution laid out the intricate web of deceit Alan had spun. I sat there as the judge read the long list of charges: wire fraud, tax, evasion, conspiracy, embezzlement. Alan stood there in a gray suit that seemed too big for him now. He was thinner. Diminished, his once proud shoulders slumped in defeat. He refused to look at me, keeping his gaze fixed on the judge, his face a stony mask. When the guilty verdict came on all counts, I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. A quiet hush fell over the courtroom. I simply sat still, my hands folded in my lap as the sharp final sound of the gavel fell. Justice outside reporters swarmed me, shouting questions, shoving microphones in my face. "Mr. Wallace, how does it feel to see your son convicted? Was it worth it? Do you have any words for Alan?" I stopped, looked directly into a camera, and answered only once. It feels necessary. Then I walked away, pushing through the crowd, and didn't look back. Back at headquarters, the company was slowly, painfully stabilizing. New leadership was stepping in, a board-approved team of men and women with clear eyes and clean hands. They promised to honor the Wallace legacy, not Allen's corruption, but the foundation I had built decades earlier in that dusty garage with 3 old trucks and a dream employees I hadn't seen in years. Drivers and warehouse managers came up to me in the hallways, shaking my hand, their eyes filled with a gratitude that was both warming and humbling. They thanked me for saving their jobs, for saving the company. It warmed me, but it also reminded me how close I had come to losing everything, how one man's greed could have wiped out the livelihoods of thousands. At night, though, the quiet was heavier than ever. My house was empty, but for the ghosts of memory, my wife gone, my son ruined and heading to prison, my grandson distant, ashamed of the Wallace name that was now synonymous with scandal. Revenge had given me justice, but it had cost me my blood. One evening, long after the scandal had faded from the headlines, I walked down by the Chicago River, watching the city lights ripple across the dark water. Tourists laughed on architectural tourboats, cars streamed across the bridges, and life moved on, as if the Wallaces had never mattered. I thought of my father, the machinist, with grease-stained hands, who once told me on the day I left for Chicago, "Son, a man's name is the only thing he truly leaves behind. Protect it." I had protected it, fiercely, ruthlessly. But as I stood there at 74 years old, a solitary figure in the heart of the city I helped build, staring at my own wavering reflection in the dark water, I realized something chilling. Sometimes protecting your name means destroying your blood, and that was the price of revenge. The months following Allen's conviction were strange, like living in the quiet gray aftermath of a storm. The winds of chaos had passed. The walls of my empire were still standing, but everything felt unsettled. The very air charged with loss. Chicago moved on with its relentless noise and its traffic, but in my sprawling empty house in Kenilworth, the silence was louder than ever. Before I spent long days at the headquarters, helping to guide the transition. The board had appointed a new CEO, a woman named Rebecca Liu, who was sharp as glass and possessed a preternatural calm under fire. She had cut her teeth in logistics on the hyper-competitive West Coast, and though younger than most of the executives, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had weathered her own battles. Employees wary and shell-shocked after Allen's reign, and the subsequent scandal, trusted her almost immediately. I found myself respecting her too. She listened, she learned, and she had a reverence for the company's history that Allen had so nakedly lacked. But for me, the office wasn't the same. The portraits on the walls, the plaques bearing my name, the conference tables where I'd once commanded respect and forged deals that shaped the industry, all of it felt like walking through a museum dedicated to a man who no longer existed. I wasn't the king anymore. I was the ghost, haunting the halls, a living reminder of a painful, necessary war. Rebecca caught me one afternoon staring out at the skyline from the executive floor, lost in thought. "You don't have to stay, Mr. Wallace," she said gently, her voice pulling me from my reverie. "You've done enough, more than enough. You saved us. Let me carry it forward now. The foundation is solid again, thanks to you." Her words struck something deep within me. I realized she was right. My war was over. My purpose had been fulfilled. Staying longer would only turn me into the bitter old man Allen once painted me, as a specter, unable to let go of the past. So I stepped back fully this time. No more advisory role, no more board meetings. I packed up the few personal items left in my office, carrying with me only one framed photograph, a black and white picture of me at 30 years old, leaning against the grill of my first truck. Eleanor grinning like a fool who thought the world was his to conquer. But revenge has ripples. It is not a clean surgical act. Alan, even behind bars in a federal penitentiary, cast a long shadow. Reporters still chased the story, writing think pieces about dynastic greed and the curse of family empires. My grandson Michael struggled the most. At 20, he was in college trying to find his own way, but his last name followed him like a scarlet letter. Professors knew, classmates whispered, even girlfriends would eventually ask about the infamous Wallaces, the weight of his father's sins and his grandfather's. Retribution was a heavy burden for a young man to carry. One night he showed up at my door unannounced, his shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with a sorrow that looked too old for his face. "Grandpa," he said, his voice breaking on the word, "why did you have to destroy Dad? Why did you have to do it so publicly?" The words cut deeper than any knife Alan had ever wielded. I poured him some water, my hand trembling slightly, and guided him to the sofa in the den. I sat across from him in the worn leather armchair. "Michael," I began, my voice raspy with an emotion I rarely showed, "I didn't destroy your father. He destroyed himself piece by piece. Long before I ever got involved, I just held up a mirror so the world could see what he'd become. I stopped him from taking the rest of us down with him. But he's still my dad." Michael whispered, tears welling in his eyes, "And you're still his father. Didn't you ever think about forgiving him? Finding another way?" I wanted to answer God. I wanted to tell him yes. But the truth was, forgiveness felt like a luxury. I couldn't afford a foreign country I could never visit. Forgiveness would have meant letting him gut the company, ruin thousands of lives, and desecrate the name my own father had taught me to cherish, above all else. Forgiveness would have been a betrayal of everything I stood for. So I said the only thing I could, the hard, cold truth. Maybe one day a better man than me could have, but not me. Not yet. Michael nodded slowly, the chasm between us widening with my words. He left that night, and I watched from the window as his silhouette disappeared into the dark Chicago streets, a young man carrying the burden of a name I had saved, but also irrevocably scarred. Alone again, I tried to find peace in small, meaningless routines. Morning walks along the cold shore of Lake Michigan, evening drinks by the fireplace, reading history books about other fallen dynasties. I wrote letters I never sent, long rambling letters to Alan in his cell, to my dead wife Sarah, even to my younger self. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I wondered if it was all worth it. Yes, I had brought down a villain, exposed a fraud, saved a company I had won the war. But at what cost? My son sat in prison, a stranger to me. My grandson barely spoke to me. My nights were colder and longer than ever, and yet when I closed my eyes, I still saw that boardroom again. The polished table, the dismissive faces, the papers sliding towards me. Alan's smirk as he stripped me of everything I had built. That moment, that pure, unadulterated betrayal, would have haunted me to my grave had I done nothing. At least now, when the memories came, they carried something else alongside the pain vindication. Then came the final chapter. The epilogue I hadn't expected. A year after the trial, I received a letter from Alan. It was shorthand written on lined paper from the prison. The handwriting was his, but the venom was something else entirely. "Father, you think you won. You think you saved your name. But all you did was prove what I always knew, that you care more about your company than your own blood. You'll die with your precious name intact, but you'll die alone, and you'll die knowing I was right about you all along. No apology, no remorse, only pure, undiluted venom. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steady. Now I placed it in the back of my study drawer, beneath old deeds and stock certificates. I never spoke of it to anyone, but it confirmed what I already knew, deep in my bones. Alan had chosen his path long ago, and nothing I could have done would have ever changed, that he was lost long before I declared war. The Wallace dynasty would survive, but it would never be the same. The bloodline was broken. One evening I found myself back at the Palmer house. Hilton drawn by some morbid curiosity, I went to the same bar, where I'd sat watching Alan bask in his fleeting glory, the same place where I had stolen his laptop and began the final war. I sat alone at the polished wooden bar, sipping bourbon, listening to the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses around me. A man at the next stool, a businessman by his suit and weary eyes, recognized me. "You're Wallace, right? James Wallace, the guy who brought down his own son." I looked at him, measured his tone. There was no judgment in his voice, only a kind of bewildered awe. "Yes," I said quietly. He shook his head, half smiling, and took a sip of his drink. "Hell of a story. Bet Hollywood will make a movie about you one day." I chuckled, a dry, empty sound. "Maybe. But if they do, they'll never capture what it really cost. Because here's the truth. The one that lingers long after the battles are won and the enemies are vanquished. Revenge gives you justice, but it doesn't give you peace." And when I finally laid my head down that night, staring into the darkness of a hotel room that smelled faintly of old carpets and bourbon, I realized something that chilled me to my very bones. Peace is something I will never know again. The end.